September 1975, New York City. The phone was ringing in a modest Bronx apartment, but the man inside wasn't answering. Outside, Manhattan was celebrating. Kiss had just received their first platinum certification for Alive, and the music industry was buzzing with the news that four guys in makeup had just changed rock and roll forever. Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, and Peter Criss were popping champagne bottles at the record label's office, surrounded by executives and photographers. But one chair remained empty. The Space Ace wasn't there. And when Gene Simmons finally reached him by phone that night, what Ace Frehley said would reveal something about the man behind the silver makeup that no one had ever truly understood. Before we dive deeper into this untold story, if you're fascinated by the real stories behind rock's greatest legends, hit that subscribe button. These are the moments that never made it into the documentaries, the truths that stayed hidden for decades. The party at Casablanca Records office was everything you'd expect from a mid-70s rock and roll celebration. Neil Bogart, the label's founder, had ordered cases of champagne. The gold and platinum record plaques were mounted on the walls, reflecting the disco ball lights that someone had insisted on installing. Gene Simmons stood in the center of the room, still wearing his stage boots from the previous night's concert, towering over everyone. Paul Stanley had his arm around a blonde woman whose name he'd already forgotten. Peter Criss was arguing with a photographer about the best angle for the group shot. But Ace Frehley's spot remained conspicuously vacant. The Alive album had done what their four previous studio albums couldn't. It captured the raw energy of Kiss in concert. The explosions, the fire-breathing, the blood-spitting, and most importantly, the guitar work of Ace Frehley that had been somewhat buried in the studio recordings. Radio stations that had ignored Kiss for two years were suddenly playing Rock and Roll All Night and Strutter on repeat. The album was selling 30,000 copies a week. For a band that had been sleeping in their tour van just 18 months earlier, this was the breakthrough they'd sacrificed everything to achieve. But Ace wasn't there to celebrate it. His absence hung over the party like a question mark no one wanted to address directly. Paul made a joke about Ace probably being at a bar somewhere. Peter suggested maybe he'd gotten the time wrong. Gene said nothing, but his jaw was tight. The truth was more complicated than anyone in that room realized. While champagne flowed and cameras flashed, Ace Frehley was sitting alone in his Bronx apartment, staring at his Gibson Les Paul guitar, wondering if this success was worth what it was costing him. Gene Simmons left the party around midnight. Not because he was tired. Gene never got tired, but because something was gnawing at him. He'd known Ace since 1973, had watched him audition with that modified Les Paul and those bluesy licks that somehow fit perfectly with Paul's glam rock sensibility. Gene understood business, strategy, marketing, but Ace understood something else. Something Gene was only beginning to recognize as essential to what Kiss actually was. The payphone outside the record label office was occupied, so Gene walked 3 blocks to find another one. The September air was humid, carrying the smell of garbage and hot dog vendors. Gene dropped coins into the slot and dialed the number he'd memorized months ago. The phone rang 6 times before Ace picked up. No hello, just breathing on the other end. Gene could hear a television in the background, some late-night talk show laugh track. Then Ace's voice, quiet and flat, in a way Gene had never heard before. "I know why you're calling." Gene started to launch into his prepared speech about team unity and shared success and the importance of showing up for moments like this. But Ace cut him off. Gene, do you know what it feels like to be invisible while everyone's looking at you? The question hung in the humid New York night. Gene, who had an answer for everything, found himself silent. Ace continued, his voice steady but carrying an edge that made Gene grip the phone receiver tighter. That party isn't about the music. It's about the numbers, the sales figures, the money. And that's fine. That's your thing. That's Paul's thing. But when I put on that makeup, when I play that guitar, I disappear into something else. Space Ace isn't me. He's who I have to be for this to work. And tonight, I couldn't do it. I couldn't put on the mask to celebrate taking off the mask. What Ace was trying to articulate in that phone call was something the other members of KISS would take years to fully understand. The makeup wasn't just a gimmick, wasn't just a marketing strategy that Bill O'Coin and Gene had cooked up. For Ace, it had become a kind of prison. Paul Daniel, Frehley from the Bronx, the quiet kid who'd learned guitar by copying records in his bedroom, had been consumed by the Space Ace character. And the platinum record, the validation that they'd finally made it, only reinforced how much of himself he'd lost in the process. Gene, standing at that payphone, made a decision that would define his relationship with Ace for the next 40 years. Instead of arguing or trying to convince Ace he was wrong, Gene just listened. For maybe the first time in their professional relationship, Gene Simmons shut up and let Ace Frehley talk. And what Ace talked about was surprisingly vulnerable for a man who projected such cool detachment on stage. He talked about his father, who died just before KISS started getting successful. How his dad never got to see him make it. How the platinum record felt hollow because the one person whose approval actually mattered wasn't around to give it. He talked about feeling like an imposter, like he didn't deserve the success because he was just a guy from the Bronx who got lucky with a guitar. He talked about the pressure of maintaining the Space Ace character, of always being the cool, mysterious one when inside he felt anxious and unsure most of the time. Gene listened to all of it, and then he said something that neither of them would ever speak about publicly, but that would fundamentally change how Gene viewed Ace from that moment forward. He told Ace that the platinum record wasn't about the numbers or the party or the executives. It was about 4 guys who'd refused to quit when every logical reason said they should. It was about Ace's guitar solo on She that made teenage girls scream and guitar players want to throw their instruments away. It was about the moment during their Detroit show when Ace's guitar caught fire during a pyrotechnic accident, and he kept playing anyway because the song wasn't finished. "You think you're invisible," Gene said, his voice carrying across the crackling phone line. "But you're the only one people actually see. Paul and I, we're performers. Peter's a showman. But you? When you play, people forget they're at a concert. That's not invisibility, Ace. That's magic." The conversation lasted 45 minutes. By the time Gene hung up, the party at Casablanca Records was winding down. Paul was drunk and trying to convince someone to go to another club. Peter had left with 2 women whose names he also didn't know. The executives were tallying up the evening's expenses and planning the next marketing push. None of them knew that 3 blocks away, their bass player had just had the most important conversation of his tenure with KISS. What made the Alive Platinum certification so significant wasn't just the commercial success. It was the moment when KISS stopped being 4 individual musicians and became a phenomenon. The live album captured something the studio recordings had diluted: the raw power and danger of their stage show. Ace's guitar work, in particular, benefited from the live format. His solos on Strutter and 100,000 Years weren't note perfect, but they had an urgency and feeling that the metronome-precise studio versions lacked. But success in the music industry comes with a cost that's rarely discussed in the celebratory press releases. For Kiss, that cost was the increasing pressure to maintain and expand the spectacle. The makeup had to be more elaborate, the pyrotechnics more dangerous, the stage show more expensive. And with each escalation, the actual music, the reason they'd started the band in the first place, got buried under layers of production and marketing strategy. Ace felt this more acutely than the others because his connection to Kiss was always primarily musical. Gene loved the business side. Paul loved being a star. Peter loved the party. But Ace just wanted to play guitar. The platinum record represented a Faustian bargain that Ace was only beginning to understand. They'd achieved the success they'd dreamed about, but in doing so, they'd committed themselves to an increasingly elaborate machine that demanded more and more of them. And for Ace, whose relationship with his own identity was already complicated by the Space Ace character, this escalation felt like a slow erasure of Paul Daniel Frehley. Gene showed up at Ace's apartment the next morning with coffee and bagels. He didn't call first, just appeared at the door around 9 a.m., which for rock musicians in 1975 was essentially the middle of the night. Ace answered in sweatpants and a t-shirt. No makeup, no persona, just a 24-year-old guy from the Bronx who looked tired and confused about why his bass player was standing in his hallway. They sat in Ace's small kitchen and didn't talk about the phone call directly. Instead, they talked about guitars. Gene knew almost nothing about guitars. He'd only picked up bass because Kiss needed one. But he asked Ace to explain his setup, his pedals, his amp preferences. And Ace, who could be monosyllabic when discussing business or image or any of the things Gene usually wanted to talk about, came alive when discussing music. He showed Gene his collection of modified guitars, explained the physics of feedback and distortion, demonstrated the wah-wah pedal technique he'd developed that would become his signature sound. Gene realized something during this conversation that would influence how he managed Kiss for the next decade. Ace needed to feel like a musician, not just a performer or a brand extension. The Space Ace character worked on stage, but Ace needed spaces where he could be Paul Frehley the guitarist, not Space Ace the product. Gene, for all his reputation as a relentless businessman, understood this. And from that morning forward, he made small but significant adjustments to how the band operated. He made sure Ace had more input in the studio, gave him longer guitar solos in the live shows, stopped pushing him to do as many press interviews where he had to maintain the Space Ace mystique. These weren't dramatic changes that anyone outside the band would notice, but they mattered to Ace. They were Gene's way of saying, "I hear you, I see you, and your value isn't just as a costume and a character." The Alive platinum record eventually went multi-platinum. Kiss became one of the biggest bands in the world. They sold millions of records, packed stadiums, created a merchandising empire that made them more money than the music itself. But for Ace Frehley, September 1975 remained a pivotal moment. It was the night he almost walked away from it all. The night he articulated feelings he'd never put into words before. The night Gene Simmons, the man most people saw as the soulless business mind of Kiss, showed him that someone actually understood. Their relationship would get complicated in the years that followed. Ace's struggles with alcohol and drugs would create tensions. Creative disagreements would lead to arguments. Eventually, Ace would leave Kiss in 1982, unable to continue being Space Ace when he was still trying to figure out who Paul Frehley was. But on that September night in 1975, when a phone rang in a Bronx apartment and a bass player stood at a payphone 3 blocks from a celebration he'd left early, something important happened. Two people who seemed completely different found common ground in an understanding that success means nothing if you lose yourself achieving it. Years later, in interviews after he'd left and returned to Kiss multiple times, Ace would occasionally reference that night. He never gave details, never explained exactly what was said or why it mattered. But he'd mention it as a moment when he almost quit, when the success felt more like a burden than an achievement, and when someone he didn't expect reached out and pulled him back from the edge. Gene, for his part, never spoke about the call publicly. Some moments aren't meant for press releases and documentaries. Some moments are just between two people who, despite their differences, understood something essential about each other. The platinum record still hangs on walls and sits in storage lockers. The Alive album still sells and streams, introducing new generations to Kiss at their raw, powerful best. But the real story of that certification isn't in the sales figures or the chart positions. It's in a phone call on a September night, when a man in makeup stayed home and the man in demon makeup came looking for him. And in that unexpected conversation, they found something more valuable than platinum. They found understanding.